Welcome everyone to our online discussion today on the topic of 20 years since the referendum on independence in Montenegro. Thank you very much for joining this discussion on a sunny Friday afternoon. Very much appreciated. My name is Victoria Vogesinger-Palm. I am the Deputy Director of the Southeast Europe Association, or short SOG. SOG is a network for expertise on the region of Southeast Europe, institutionally funded by the German Federal Foreign Office. And events like today are actually part of our mandate to inform an interested public on recent developments, but also on past events in the region and what we can learn from them. In this context, we want to take a look today at Montenegro, a country which is being talked about quite a lot lately, mostly due to its progress concerning the EU enlargement negotiations and its reforms, but also a country which gained its independence from Serbia actually yesterday, 20 years ago. So on the 21st of May, 2006. But I don't want to take too much away from the discussion and from our moderator, and would at this stage actually only like to welcome our distinguished panelists of today and introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Ramiza Bajrami. Ramiza has studied governance and public policy as well as international relations at the University of Passau and the Andrássy University in Budapest. In her research, she focused, among other things, on the diaspora of the Western Balkans. Currently, she works as an EU project manager at the German Federal Police. But most importantly, of course, she is a member of SOG, our organization, since 2024, and she's very active in the branch of young professionals within our organization. And in this capacity, she has already initiated a number of events and discussion for our organization, including, for instance, a book presentation with Jasmin Mujanovic last year and, of course, today's discussion. So thank you very much, Ramiza, for the initiative to organize today's event and on this very timely topic. And now I hand over to you for introducing the speakers and moderating the exchange. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Victoria, for this opportunity. And today I would like to warmly welcome everyone to our panel discussion, 20 years since the Montenegro referendum. And I'm very pleased to organize this event together with the Southeast Europe Association. 20 years ago, Montenegro's independence referendum marked a historic turning point, with 55.5% in favor of independence and a voter turnout of 86%. The referendum not only brought an end to the state union of Serbia and Montenegro, but also marked the final chapter in the dissolution of Yugoslavia. 2 decades later, important questions still remain. What political, societal, and international consequences did this moment set in motion? How has it shaped Montenegro's trajectory? And what can tell us about the broader developments in the Western Balkans today? Montenegro is now considered one of the EU candidate countries with a realistic prospect of joining the European Union by 2030. At the same time, domestic political developments, evolving regional relations, and wider geopolitical shifts continue to create new opportunities and challenges. These are some of the issues we aim to explore in today's discussion. I'm especially pleased to welcome our distinguished panelist. Claudia Laštro is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz, and editor of Contemporary Southeastern Europe. Her research focuses on elite dynamics and authoritarian regimes in the Western Balkans and South Caucasus. Jelena Džankić is program director for the Widening Europe program at the European University Institute in Florence and co-director of Global CIT. Her research focuses on citizenship, Europeanization, and political developments in the Western Balkans. Vesko Garčević is a professor of the practice of international relations at Potsdam University and a former Montenegrin diplomat. During his diplomatic career, he held key positions during Montenegro's democratic transition and therefore brings not only academic expertise, but also valuable first-hand insights into this important period. He's also co-author of Montenegro and Serbia, A Velvet Divorce, the first comprehensive analysis of this transitioning period. I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion, which brings together academic perspectives and personal experiences. With that, I would like to move to our opening statements, starting with Claudia Laštro. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ramiza. Thank you, everyone. And thanks very much to the Southeast Europe Association for inviting me. So I was thinking, before delving into the trajectory of Montenegro since independence and also exploring how independence was realized, I was thinking it would be worth also looking at why it was pursued in the first place, or in the way it was. So I think in the context of Yugoslavia's dissolution, with all republics declaring independence, and later also Kosovo, Montenegro's sovereignty seems kind of to logically fit into this pattern, which also resonates with domestic political narratives, particularly those which emerge from the camp of the formerly dominant DPS, the Democratic Party of Socialists. So this party was in government from 1990 until 2020, and during its tenure, it advanced from the closest ally of Milosevic to his fiercest opponent, and eventually the main driver of independence and state building. So the DPS commonly explains its trajectory by referring to economic and political necessities in the early 1990s to stay in alliance with Serbia and Milosevic, also alleging that there was a large faction which had always fostered aspirations for independence and just waited for the right opportunity to break away. But as we know, political realities are oftentimes more complex. So I will use my opening statement to provide a more layered account of Montenegro's independence, why it was realized and why it was in the way it did. Which does not mean that it wouldn't have materialized in a different way by different means. But as I see it, the way Montenegro, or why Montenegro pursued independence in the way and the time it did, was roughly the result of three factors. So first, a growing disenchantment with Milosevic across all factions of the DPS, an intensifying power struggle between Prime Minister Đukanović and President Bulatović, and then also the self-enforcing tendencies of the post-split coalition building, both on the domestic and international levels. So when we look at the relationship between the DPS and Milosevic, there's some truth in the narrative that Montenegro joined the state union with Serbia in 1992 out of necessity. So Montenegro always was one of Yugoslavia's so-called underdeveloped regions and always dependent on state subsidies. So it was also a center of Yugoslavia's heavy industry, which was hit especially hard in the 1980s during the financial and economic crisis. So the outlook of self-sufficiency was not that bright. But there's also an ideological component. Because in the 1980s, rising Serb nationalism took also hold in Montenegro. So there were traditional connections between the political elite educated in Belgrade, the cultural institutions of both republics, the media. So these institutions presented channels of dissemination and reception of nationalism by the Serbian intelligentsia, which was also conflated with some anti-establishment rhetoric, such as visions for democratization, economic reform, which sort of presented an umbrella for the mass movement in Montenegro and the workers' demonstration of the 1980s. But it was also a winning ticket for the second-rank communist elites, who that was sort of also in the 1980s a power struggle ongoing between the top and the second layer. So once the second layer overthrew the old elite, they aligned conveniently with Milosevic, who was also the most popular or more popular politician in Montenegro than he was at the time in Serbia. So initially, one can say that both reform communist parties were more or less on the same page, also regarding the initiation of the war in Croatia. But then during the war, tactical and structural differences began to sharpen. So Montenegro's economy was more vulnerable to the international embargo, as it was heavily dependent on trade and tourism. And also the DPS faced a stronger anti-war and also anti-Milosevic opposition, which coordinated its activities in the mid-1990s. So these sort of disputes emerged between the two leaderships, which led to repeated sanctions by Serbia, which again prompted the DPS to seek alternative alliances and more independent initiatives, which does not mean that they envisioned state independence at the time, but they were trying to foster greater autonomy within the framework of the FRY. So interestingly, but it was the war ending which prompted a power struggle inside the DPS. So one has to acknowledge that President Bulatović, who had a more elevated position, was the primus inter pares, let's say, in the DPS, which is also a result of his institutional position. So he had a closer institutional relationship with Milosevic, who was the most prominent figure, most important figure in the FRY. He had also always a seat at international negotiation tables for peace agreements. So this position, of course, then became less important with the signing of the Dayton Peace Accord. And one was also to stress that there were in '96 demonstrations ongoing by the Zajedno opposition in Serbia, which kind of, raised the prospect of Milosevic potentially losing power. Đukanović, on the other hand, as prime minister, he was in charge of the management of everyday affairs, so keeping the economy afloat, paying wages, pensions, also by help of international cigarette smuggling schemes. And so he became more important as the post-Dayton environment made economic issues more important and raised them to the foreground. But also one has to say that Đukanović, in generally through his institutional position, he was more accountable to domestic stakeholders than Bulatović was, which also rendered him more assertive towards Milosevic and also towards Bulatović, from whom he demanded a greater share of power. So in '97, Bulatović tried to discipline Đukanović, which led to the party split. So of course, such a split needs to be justified, which Đukanović did by alleging that he had always fostered anti-Milosevic stances and kind of showcased himself as a reformer and Democrat, which was not least to the fact that through this, he could cater to the pro-independence and anti-Milosevic opposition, who he needed for parliamentary support for his government after the split. So that's where finally the self-enforcing tendencies of coalition building come in. Because after the split, Đukanović took over the main infrastructure of the DPS, but also the main ministries but one in the government. So Bulatović had a lack of resources and was pushed into even closer dependence of Milosevic, which is also mirrored in his party, new party's profile. So Đukanović, on the other hand, he became more reliant on the forces of the opposite political spectrum, which had also an international dimension, because with the outbreak of the war in Kosovo, Montenegro became an important ally for the West against their campaign against Milosevic. So to circumvent the embargo imposed by Milosevic on the FRY, which on Montenegro, which did not participate in the war in Kosovo, and the international embargo on the FRY due to the war, Western governments, especially the US, channeled immense amounts of budgetary funding to Montenegro's government, and also institutional support in terms of institution building, such as the National Bank and independent currency system. So by '99, Montenegro had de facto reached independence, and also in societal surveys, it seemed that there was a clear trend towards sovereignty. So in this scenario, Milosevic being in power actually served Montenegro's autonomy. However, with Milosevic's defeat in the 2000 federal elections, this autonomy suddenly was threatened. And this was mainly by three reasons, and I'm going to wrap it up. So first of all, international attention quickly shifted from Montenegro to the democratic opposition of Serbia. So while Montenegro used to be the main power broker, they suddenly found themselves in the backbench. Also, it's important to emphasize that some actors inside the democratic opposition of Serbia were staunch nationalists who regarded Montenegro as a somewhat inferior partner. So it became obvious, let's say, that continuing an alliance with Serbia would mean to lose some of the earned weight and autonomy. And finally, the DPS had boycotted the 2000 elections. So this had an important consequence, because the Montenegrin representatives now in the federal government were predominantly composed of the opposition to the DPS. So first and foremost, Bulatović's party. So keeping the state federation also meant to leave a way open for interference, both from the federal as well as the domestic level, and unresolved statehood would remain an issue domestically. So so this was basically the context in which the Belgrade Agreement was concluded, and I believe that Vesko has more to say about that, so I would hand over the word to him.
Shall I begin, or I will wait for an intro, Ramiza?
You can continue, because I think it goes hand in hand with what Claudia said, so I think it's after to continue.
Okay, then if I can just continue with a story about the referendum and Montenegro and European Union at this time. Indeed, after the change of government, after Milosevic having been toppled in Belgrade in 2001, European Union found itself in a structurally awkward position. It opposed Montenegrin independence in principle and referendum, and it was obvious, particularly in 2001, when the enthusiasm for a new government in Belgrade was very high. I remember when we were in UN at that year, having meetings with the European Union officials. They were all very much, let's say, concerned or cautious regarding Montenegrin attempts or intention to organize referendum on independence. That said, legal and political logic of the Belgrade Agreement 2002, but not just Belgrade Agreement, but Intercommission recommendations. And in fact, from the international legal point of view, Montenegro and Serbia were independent states before the creation of Yugoslavia, first Yugoslavia, and then the second Yugoslavia. Therefore, legal arguments were in hands of Montenegro. Nobody could challenge the right of Montenegro to organize referendum. So the things have a little bit shifted when it comes to the EU approach after Đinđić's assassination in March 2003. So Belgrade Agreement was signed, and I will speak about what the problems with the Belgrade Agreement and the creation of the Union of Serbia and Montenegro were. But then the enthusiasm, I would say, of the European Union for the new government and the new elites in Belgrade started waning out after Đinđić's assassination, which in fact removed the most credible pro-European voice in Serbia, and making Belgrade's political environment more volatile and unpredictable, and it was visible. So approaching the referendum, Montenegro had to deal with two-track problems, and this is why European Union was important. First of all, Montenegro didn't need to win the EU permission to organize in a way to organize a referendum. It didn't need to meet legal argument when it comes to the right to organize referendum. But what Montenegro very much needed is legitimacy of the process. So, and for the legitimacy of that process, it needed support of European Union. And this legitimacy is needed, in order to reinforce from outside the idea of referendum and how referendum is going to be structured and conducted. First of all, to have a strong argument and to put Serbia on board so that Serbia couldn't delegitimize the process. And secondly, and very importantly, it is of importance domestically because Montenegro needed European Union for opposition to the referendum and opposition to those who were running opposition parties and who were opposing independence to accept the process and accept eventual results of the referendum. You know well that Montenegro was internally divided, that opposition to the independence was really strong, and that the opposition parties who were advocating against independence were supported by Belgrade. This is why European Union involvement and the EOSC involvement as an observer of the process was not just symbolic in this case. It was, in fact, a mechanism that allowed, ensured mutual acceptance of the results for Montenegrin unionists, for those who supported union with the Montenegro, with Serbia, for Serbian government, because EU stands behind that, and for the international community, because with the European Union involvement, referendum results, if they are positive, will be easily accepted and legitimate. So why European Union and why the union was not, this union created by the Belgrade Agreement, was not so, in fact, good, and the union itself has given a strong argument to Montenegro to go for the referendum. In fact, I would say that a union between Serbia and Montenegro, designed by the Belgrade Agreement, was not federation. It was something between federation and confederation, and was almost engineered to fail. And it had several structural dysfunctions, and those dysfunctions reflected the fact that the two republics or two constituencies of that union had fundamentally diverged, and they had a fundamentally diverged interests in this. First of all, power parity despite size asymmetry. Serbia was 18 times larger than Montenegro. But at the same time, Belgrade Agreement made legal framework so that Montenegro was treated equal to Serbia. And then this, in fact, created internal structural problems, if not deep and existing problems between Serbia and Montenegro. Then monetary union didn't exist. So this was a really unique, peculiar country called federation with two dual currencies, euro in Montenegro and dinar in Serbia. Therefore, this undermined economic and financial well-being or functioning of that union. And then finally, two constituencies had divergent foreign policy goals. Montenegro supported Kosovo's independence. Montenegro wanted to shift towards the West, while Serbia was at that time still cautious and rhetorically for European Union, but in fact, in practice, not so much. So to come to the very important issue here is why 55% solution. Given this framework against this backdrop, European Union definitely couldn't stop the referendum, particularly not out of the Belgrade Agreement. But at the same time, it wanted to shape the meaning of the result and the process as such. So in order to avoid instability and the conflict that may arise from razor-thin result crisis, which means that one side wins with 51% or 50 and something percent, and given the history of wars in former Yugoslavia and really fresh memories from the 90s, European Union wanted to introduce something new, which will, let's say, help facilitate the process. This is also to keep Serbia on board and to make process transparent by being involved in that process. And finally, to prevent opposition from boycotting referendum. So therefore, you needed to make some, let's say, preconditions relatively challenging to achieve independence, but at the same time still encouraging for all the parties to take part in this process. There are several ideas were floating at the time. One of them was 60%, and another one was a two-thirds majority. But finally, 55% was taken as a threshold, which can actually incentivize all the sides to participate in the process.
Thank you, Vesko, for your introduction. And I would like to give Jelena the word for her opening statement regarding the front runner Montenegro, which it is today.
Thank you so much, Ramiza, and thank you to for the invitation. It's not easy to go after such two brilliant first interventions. So what I'll do is focus essentially on how the dynamics of internal contestation of statehood and nationhood have evolved after the independence referendum and how they have played out in the context of Europeanization. And Europeanization here is something that I define very broadly and contextually linked to the process of EU integration, where Montenegro at this very moment is considered to be a frontrunner. Now, I'll start with a personal observation, which I think is not shared by everyone, but it also could be a point of discussion amongst us and perhaps with the audience in the future. And that's that after the independence referendum, the DPS missed the opportunity to essentially balance out the nationalist rift that existed in Montenegro, because between 2006 and 2013, there was essentially an opportunity for the country to move forward and for the nationalisms of the two different sides to, in a way, subsume. And this was something that they actually capitalized on later. Now, the way I see the process between this nationalist divide in Montenegro evolving in the context of EU accession, it's playing out through four waves. So if you bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'll try and explain what I mean here. So if we think about the first period between 2006 and 2013, we could characterize this as the forward wave. And this is something when there was a lot of enthusiasm within the European Union after the 2004 enlargement. And that also coincided with the enthusiasm in Montenegro after the recently acquired independence. So if you think about what has happened in terms of the country's Europeanization and EU integration pathway, in December 2008, Montenegro submitted its candidacy plea to the European Union. In 2008-2009, the visa liberalization successfully took place. The country was instituted a visa-free regime with the Schengen countries in late 2009. And those of us who've lived in the Western Balkans in the 1990s and the early 2000s knew what a hassle was just going through the process of obtaining a Schengen visa. So this was a massive incentive for the local elites to also initiate reforms that were required through this process. In 2010, the country gained an opinion, a positive opinion for EU membership, with the caveat that the accession negotiations would start following a series of reform, including that of electoral legislation, media freedom, anti-discrimination laws, etc., which eventually led to the opening of accession negotiations with Montenegro in June 2012. Now, what I want to say by this is kind of listing all of these achievements was that at that point, there was a lot of momentum because there was a synergy between Brussels and the political elites in Montenegro. So there was this kind of a push for the country to reform and to move ahead in the process. This is also the time where we could see a lot of domestic consensus on integration. And this is why I'm saying that this period essentially marked a kind of a missed opportunity to perpetuate this consensus. Now, what followed was not a very beautiful time, and it's something that I refer to as the static wave. And this static wave was mainly driven by the enlargement fatigue on the side of Brussels. Because after the accession of Croatia to the European Union, there was this kind of a stalemate in the process of EU integration. There was the unfortunate statement of Jean-Claude Juncker in 2014, which was a statement of fact, if we are to be realistic. But it has been taken, words have meaning, and it has been taken as a symbol of the fact that these countries will stagnate in the next 5 years. And that's precisely what happened in the context of EU integration in Montenegro, but also in other countries in the region to a large extent. Now, when you have a stagnation of the process where people were and the elites were in a way reasonably enthusiastic, what happens was that these elites then turn inwards, which also in a way enabled the furthering of the state capture by the DPS, but also the deepening of this ethno-political rift, which predated also this period. This was also the time where nationalism was brought back into public debates and where increasingly in the open, the opponents of the DPS were characterized as anti-European, as anti-state and anti-democratic. So this is kind of a stalemate, frozen period of Montenegrin pathway or relationship with the European Union. And if you think about what was happening in practice, over the period of nearly 10 years of Montenegro's trajectory towards the EU, only 3 negotiation chapters have been closed, 2 of which highly technical. So this is something to have in mind, that the process was also not moving forward. Now, between 20 and 22, we can talk about the third wave in the context of Montenegro's relationship with the EU after independence. Now, this period is something that I like to refer to as the broken wave, because it was characterized by instability. It was characterized by unpredictable political decisions, the return of full-scale ethno-religious cleavage, but also a complete stalemate in the context of EU accession. This was also the COVID period, so a lot of the domestic political instability reflected simply as the complete overshadowing of any kind of progress in the context of EU integration. And now finally, since February 2022, due to the Russian full-scale aggression on Ukraine, there has been a geopolitical push in the context of EU enlargement. And within this push, Montenegro has emerged as a frontrunner for EU accession. Now, I have to say, in the meantime, it's kind of several governments have changed in Montenegro. And I think Claudia mentioned that the DPS was in power until 2020. And it's kind of the push of Montenegro, the fact that the country is a frontrunner in the context of EU integration, is not because the country is performing exceptionally well. The position of Montenegro in the context of current EU enlargement is essentially attributable fully and nearly completely to the push that they are receiving from Brussels. However, what we can see domestically is that these nationalist undercurrents, which have existed for a long time in Montenegro, they seem to be pacified. So we can see that the Serb line has been pacified by participating in a pro-European government. And if you see their very recent statements, they all support this push for Montenegro to enter the European Union. So this is a kind of a change of rhetoric, and this is something that I think is incredibly important and is something that will define the contours or the ease with which the process will evolve in the coming years. And we also see that the Montenegrin side essentially has less capacity to mobilize around hardcore identitarian issues, which I think is, in the context of EU accession, a good thing. Now, again, the domestic consensus is mainly attributed to this push from the EU. This leaves us with the question mark, and I'll end by this. How is this wave going to end? Now, internally, it will depend a lot on how these rival political camps can essentially manage and handle the final stages of accession. To what extent there will be interference also from external elements, and we can discuss this in the Q&A session, in a way trying to limit or create challenges in Montenegro's trajectory and aspirations to achieve its goal of joining the EU by the end of the decade. But also it depends on the external dynamics of enlargement and on whether accession will take place in the end, because I believe that there's a lot at stake and that a broken promise in the context of Montenegro would have negative spillovers, not only for the Western Balkan region, but also more broadly for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would kindly remind the audience, if you have a question, just post them in the Q&A, and I will read them out at the end. My first question would be something concerning the political landscape in the party system of Montenegro. Both the head of government and the head of state, meaning Jakov Milatovic and Milojko Spajic, are rather young. They are not even 40, and they are part of Europe Now, which is a party which is pro-European and very progressive. Can you evolve on the problem of the legacies that the previous governments have left for these new aspiring parties that they have to deal with, and how does their youth contribute to this fact, and what kind of changes they have to transform Montenegro in a young European country?
Shall I go first, or would like to go first?
Go, Claudia. We can add on too.
Okay.
You can share.
So I think the emergence of the movement Europe Now for many people presented kind of a hopeful point in Montenegrin politics, because we had a large tent party which had a cross cleavage appeal, and as Jelena mentioned before, there was this very clear bloc voting and party competition along national lines, which seemed to be dissolved with a populist movement which promoted mostly economic patterns, which was also partially echoed when we look at the 23 presidential elections, for example, where Andrija Mandić was not recognizable anymore with his campaign. So, but now it seems kind of, when we're looking at recent trends, that there might be an indication that we might be going back to en bloc voting, for example, because in recent surveys we see that the movement Europe Now lost nearly 10 percentage points, whereas the Future for Montenegro considerably gained, and the DPS has kind of a solid 25% support. So still the party with the largest share of support. So I think, there are several factors probably involved in this. So, for example, there was a split in the movement for Europe Now in 23 between Milatovic and Spajic, so which was partially because of ideological differences, with Europe Now going into coalition with the Future for Montenegro, but also a power struggle about political appointments to managerial boards, and also party control. And I think, that this sort of infighting made the party seem less reliable to voters and more insecure, but also they lost sort of their centrist large tent appeal due to the coalition with the former Democratic Front, Future for Montenegro, which also let voters travel back to the pro-Montenegrin camp. And also they were not living up so much to their campaign promises. So of course, they were campaigning for wage raises, which were materialized by cutting back on contributions of healthcare and pensions, but living costs are also in constant incline. So I think another factor is probably that also the Future for Montenegro, they are now in government, and they have also access to resources, and they can serve their own constituency in partisan employment. And also, as Jelena mentioned, Mandić is kind of considerably moderated his stances, and is more kind of, more a programmatic pro-Westerner, also kind of, stressing kind of, the obligations of Montenegro to NATO, which kind of, probably explains to a part why they are currently kind of, in a trend upwards. And finally, I think the DPS captured quite a lot of disenchanted voters from Europe now, but also it remains a cohesive force. So I think, there are kind of, several reasons why kind of, we can see that the current government has quite a difficult legacy to deal with, and kind of, is not on shaky grounds, which Jelena already stressed, the EU integration, where there are kind of, of course, on paper, it seems like there's progress and there's momentum, but we will see how the consequences will really play out and what this means for the government. But we also have to understand that this government now, which is very heterogeneous, has kind of, they are united by their antagonism still to the DPS, which is necessary to exclude them for their political survival, because they have to deliver tangible gains without the DPS, and capitalize on this honeymoon phase where they can still scapegoat the DPS. But we can also see that they are kind of, united by power. So currently the government has the largest share, the largest set of ministries, so which shows kind of, clientelism, corruption is still a major issue. Also intransparent investment schemes, which are very harmful to the environment and also the people living into Montenegro. We still have a lack of an internal party democracy, and still kind of, a lack of transparent party financing. So there are a lot of issues which remain and which continue from the last government, which are not only the fault, let's say, of the past governments.
Now, if I can just add 2 sentences, thanks, Claudia. It's kind of very much along the lines of what I would also have highlighted. But I wouldn't take their age into consideration that much, Ramiza, because when Đukanović and Bulatović came to power in Montenegro, they were in the public discourse described as mladi, lijepi, pametni, young, smart, and beautiful. And there is this kind of, if you wish, tradition unspoken of Montenegro having reasonably young leaders, with the exception of Krivokapić. Now, what I think the legacies is that have remained from the DPS rule are precisely those that Claudia has mentioned. So clientelism, a lot of state capture, which the current government essentially seems to emulate, not to the extent that they were done during the DPS times, but we can also see the despoilment of public funds. We can see a lot of shady investments. We can see questionable appointments across the different layers of government. So we can see very similar practices to those that existed. Now, what we have to have in mind here, and especially when it comes to appointments in the public service, is that Montenegro is a tiny country. So it has very limited capacities. And once you start replacing people, you're losing perhaps those who have learned being and handling issues in public administration for a long time, who could carry on the process of EU accession. So these are the things that Montenegro will have to consider in the coming years.
If I may add, from my point of view, a couple of points. Just to continue along the same line, I agree with what you have said. I will not comment on the problems that Montenegro is still facing, problems that you have rightly highlighted here, like corruption and like clientelism, like replacements of people who have been professional with new guys who are now have clear political affiliation. But I want to just to draw your attention to something which I, as a Montenegrin, can see being present there, maybe undercurrent, what is even there. But the fact that current Montenegro very much, when it comes to the support to the independence, resembles Montenegro of 2006, which we can speak about 55 to 60% of people who are supportive to independence. The figures didn't change so much, and I agree with the points of my colleagues before that this period following the independence was maybe the critical for Montenegro to do more, but somehow remained the potential remained untapped. Here, I will also say that those shifts that we have noticed in support to particular parties, in fact, are shifts within those groups. So we don't see people moving from one to another bloc, let's say so, but within blocks, they move from one to another party, which they consider closer to them. And finally, my final point, yes, I agree that this is a good sign that some parties like Democratic Party or Mandić himself supports now European Union membership. But I will read also this as a political opportunism at this point and staying in power, as you have said. And one more point, and I will conclude here, and we can discuss this later, maybe in more detail later on. Mandić is considered, since you mentioned the age of two leaders, Prime Minister and President, by Montenegrins and by Montenegrin analysts today, and not just Montenegrin analysts, regional analysts as well. Mandić is considered the strongest political figure in Montenegro currently, and often described as a power behind the throne, the one who is in fact the most powerful political figure in Montenegro, regardless of his official position as a president of the parliament.
Thank you very much. I would like to shift maybe the conversation to the question of Montenegrin identity. In an interview, a voter who opposed independence said that today they are no longer Crnogorci, but everyone is simply Montenegrin. What does this tell us about identity formation, state building, and political belonging in post-independence Montenegro?
If I can now, okay, Claudia, you can go. Feel free to jump in.
No, I was just mentioning, I think it's actually a perfect question for Jelena if she would like to go first this round.
I was hoping to hand over to Vesko, but yeah, now, look, I think that when it comes to questions of national identity, what has been incredibly fluctuating in Montenegro over the past 3 decades have been labels and their meaning. Because if we think about the population census results in the first half of in the early 1990s, they were very much different from the census results in 2003, where the population of the self-declared Montenegrins in a way was twice as high as in 2003. So it was, if I remember correctly, and I should need to check the exact numbers, in the 90s it was around 60-something% Montenegrins, around 30% those who self-identified as Serbs, and the rest were different kinds of minorities. Whereas in the early 2000s, the number of Montenegrins remained between 45 and 50%, the number of Serbs around 30%, and the rest were different kinds of minorities. Now, what I have seen and how I explained this shift in some of my work was that what these labels and categories, Montenegro and Serb, meant has changed over time. So it's not that one group died out and the other one replaced them, but it's simply that people understood the meaning of the word Montenegrin different in 1990s and different in 2003, and the most recent census results are very close to those in 2003. So what I believe has happened after the referendum was simply the stabilization of those identity labels, right? Whether you would be Montenegrin, whether you would affiliate yourself with Montenegro's independence, whether you would declare as a speaker of the Montenegrin language, which church you would go to, and interestingly, quite a lot of people who you would normally consider, again, identity is a matter of self-identification. To be ethnic minorities, they would also embrace the Montenegrin national project and frequently self-identify as Montenegrin. So I think that this is the main cleavage and the essentially the shift in the perception of identity or in people's self-identification with labels Montenegrin, Serb, or anything else that one could choose on the population census are the result of the internal divisions in Montenegro over statehood and identity, whereby progressively the label of being Montenegrin has been associated with the independence project and the DPS, whereas the label or the category of Serb was increasingly associated with the so-called unionists and those who sought to stay in the common state with Serbia, believing that Montenegrins and Serbs are part of the same people. And that's my interpretation of what has happened, but happy to hear Claudia's and Vesko's thoughts.
If I may, like, jump in with my comments. Thank you, Jelena. I think you pointed out, actually, you shifted our discussion towards the really more important issues and this self, let's say, identification of Montenegrins dynamics. Identity dynamics itself is not static. It changes, and identities change, and national identities change and develop. In Europe particularly. If we want to just for a moment step out from the current development and the politicization or maybe weaponization of the idea of national identity or identity itself, and look at how Montenegrins declare themselves as perceive themselves in the past. According to the records from the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Montenegrins mainly considered themselves as Montenegrins, but by religion, if you ask them who you are by religion, they would often answer Serbian Orthodox or Serbs. So this actually speaks about the duality and dichotomy in identity. And this brings us to the role of the church, because the church, which is dominant, one of the dominant, not just religious, but political factors in Montenegro, in fact, has been trying for, since the creation of Yugoslavia, to reshape this identity dynamics and to put equation mark between going to Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, with being served by national identity. And that has become very dominant lately. You mentioned some census results, and I agree with you, and is always also politically questionable which year to use as a starting point and how to describe change. Some people who want to present the current results as the right ones would say that census from Yugoslav times are not reliable because Montenegrins were not aware of who they were, and therefore they declare themselves as Montenegrins more than Serbs, while others would say that current census and the census before it and this shift in how people declare themselves has been a result of aggressive approach of Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro, trying to reshape or trying to reverse the process or trying to teach people that they are not Montenegrins, but they are Serbs because they go to church. This opens questions that we may discuss for days and weeks here, and I will stop here. I don't want to occupy more of our time.
Yeah, thank you very much. So maybe I can offer a few complementary notes on what Jelena and Vesko already said. So I disagree definitely that we should disentangle when we talk about Serbian identity, Montenegro and Serbian actors, kind of, because they're different levels. And you already mentioned kind of the societal level, which is of course, based on traditional ties between Serbia and Montenegro, and they still persist. So kind of their families, which go across borders, economic relations, media, culture, institution, and so on and so forth. So identities can be hybrid, they can be dual. They can be politicized, but they don't necessarily mean that people necessarily who self-identify as Serbs, that they always would necessarily vote for pro-Serbian parties and that they would feel represented by them. And for example, Herceg-Novi shows this pattern, right? Because the majority of the population there identifies as Serb, but in the past, it's always been, or for many years, it's been quite a stronghold of the DPS. And I think, this maybe what I can add is also a few notes about the political level, because when we talk about developments and shifts in current days in Montenegro, we mentioned, of course, it's a new thing that we have pro-Serbian parties in government. It's the first time since 2001 when the People's Party left government, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that they are the natural allies of the government in Serbia. So I think there are also a lot of fluctuation as there is with identity on the societal level. So, for example, in the post-independence period, we saw that the government in Montenegro and the Serbian government, they were not in good relations. Under Tadic, he constantly tried to intervene on the behalf of Serbs in Montenegro. And it was only with the ascent of the Serb Progressive Party under Tomislav Nikolic and then Aleksandar Vučić, that the relationship was kind of normalized. And we then had this first state visit of Đukanović to Serbia. And also these both actors, they had kind of a pragmatic relationship based on their EU aspirations. And also, some alleged that they were also connected by some, behind the scenes power brokers. And so this relationship then again diminished in 2020 when Vučić supported the DF and also the church Litia in Montenegro. So we have now a situation where many would say there's kind of, a very kind of consolidated line between Belgrade and especially the pro-Serbian parties in government. But there's still a lot of room for speculation, and there's still kind of, because we don't know how the situation will develop, because the For the Future of Montenegro coalition does not seem to be as consolidated as it was in the beginning. So with Mandić kind of, being more pragmatic, we see that Knežević, he kind of left government, pulled his support in parliament for the coalition. So we don't really know how the main power brokers would be in Montenegro. Also, Vučić has his own troubles. We don't know if he will outlast the next elections. Also with Mandić, he used to have kind of, always a very fond relationship. He's the one who's not openly supporting Vučić right now. So we will see on the political level how the situation will play out, because the situation in both countries is still rather volatile.
Hang on. The European integration process being so accelerated and a prospect to EU membership until 2030. What do you think is the main task for the new parties, including DPS in Europe? Which topics need to be consolidated for them to be an effective partner on the European party landscape? I think, Claudia, you could start with that question.
That's personally the hardest for me to give advice on what to do, but maybe I can give us a short recap, because I saw also in the Q&A section there's a question of how we evaluate the progress, the often mentioned recently made progress in EU integration. So I think, as Jelena mentioned, there's a huge momentum right now, both domestically and also internationally. So we see the kind of the very first substantial progress in EU chapters since 2003, which is also a result of there was this prolonged period of stagnation, which Jelena mentioned, and then also these repeated government instabilities after the DPS was ousted. But now we have 15 chapters provisionally closed. We have constantly positive evaluations of the EU Commission. Also, there seems to be fight of corruption on high level. So there are indictments, although a low rate of prosecution. And one has also to say they're more targeted at kind of, remnants of the DPS and actors and state institutions associated with the DPS. But we have also to say that there are also chapters which lost momentum, especially 23, 24, where last year still the EU Commission mentioned well, some progress, where now it's stressed as limited progress. We also have the veto from Croatia, which emerged in late 24 due to the Jasenovac convention in Montenegro's parliament. So this is still an issue which needs to be bilaterally resolved. So also there's still other issues which need to be resolved to unblock the veto between Croatia and Montenegro. We still see that institutions are vulnerable to political interference. So maybe to give just one example, recently there was a new law implemented on internal affairs, which basically very much centralizes power in the Ministry of Interior on police appointment, and also gives state intelligence huge leverage in accessing political and impersonal data, which is in a clear break of EU norms and data protection. Also, we still have a lot of judicial and state prosecutors' positions vacant. So the Constitutional Court is currently short of one judge, which leads to repeated deadlock. And we had situations where actually there was a deadlock in the Constitutional Court on laws implemented or going through Parliament, where the government then claimed, based on the deadlock, they were legal. So we can see kind of, there's still a lot of unresolved issues. And of course, there is a reform progress going on. But we can see, I would totally agree with Jelena saying that the main kind of, momentum also derives from the EU's push based on the war in Ukraine, but also the attempt to curtail, of course, other foreign forces, like China becoming a more important economic actor in Russia, of course, in the Western Balkans.
I think Claudia gave a wonderful response to this question. So if I can just add my 2 cents, because Ramiza, you started by asking what's the main task for the parties in Montenegro right now. And my kind of answer from the top of my head would be not to mess things up like they did with the resolution on Jasenovac, which was essentially pushed forward a day after Montenegro received the famous IBAR interim benchmark assessment report, which then allows the country to start closing accession negotiation chapters. And I would agree very much that the key challenges are still in the domain of chapters 23 and 24, especially when it regards the questions of the rule of law, because there is a reason why these chapters are those that are open first and closed last. You need the rule of law. I also saw a question about environmental protection. There are questions about the internal market, and you need the rule of law to essentially take part in the EU's internal market. Now, right now, a couple of weeks ago, the European Union started to establish this group for drafting the accession treaty with Montenegro. And I think what's going to be in that accession treaty will be hugely important for the country's future development, especially as regards safeguards for the rule of law and how these will be addressed in the accession treaty, because one of the key objectives of the European Union for this enlargement and hopefully with the subsequent ones is to prevent the kind of democratic backsliding and the rise of illiberalism that they had faced with Orban in Hungary. So in this way, I think Montenegro will be a kind of a test case for these new, if you wish, the new generation of accession treaties that the European Union will develop.
Thank you, Claudia and Jelena. I have really little to add when it comes to the process itself, and I agree with you what you have mentioned, that what needs to be done, and particularly Jelena, I really agree with your points that the worst thing that Montenegro can do now is to mess up in the process and to actually create enemies in the neighborhood, particularly Croatia. And that brings us to the point about government, something that we discussed before, for the political opportunism for many of members who are currently in the government. They embrace the idea of European Union membership, but in fact, sometimes, deliberately or not, that's the question, but we can discuss this, they in fact make this process more difficult. But on top of it, I may mention that the environment will remain, and environmental protection will remain a big issue in Montenegro. Though we declare themselves as an eco-state, in fact, we really care very little about that. This is my impression as a somebody who is not expert. This is not my cup of tea, but that goes across several domains, and the way how some projects are done, transparency of those projects, and lack of interest for their environmental impact those projects make. But putting this in a broader context, this is my last point. I would say that European Union enlargement has been always a political issue, which means no country has joined European Union just on ticking all the boxes. You need to keep into account geopolitical context, which sometimes is helpful to enlargement and sometimes is going against the idea of enlargement. We are now really in a moment which Ramiza mentioned at the beginning, in a moment which is at least good from a geopolitical point of view, good for enlargement, and Montenegro can be a good example for that. For the European Union, it is not just taking on board one more country or dealing with Ukraine, what to do with Ukraine, but it's also about other more important geopolitical issues and global issues, what the European Union is going to be in the future, its global posture, its strategic autonomy, and its relations with Russia in Europe once, if we can imagine that scenario, the war in Ukraine is over. So, and that opens the space for enlargement and Montenegro as well. And I would look at this from that perspective as well. If we just look at what has been done, then I would say Montenegro will need more time than 3 years.
It's very interesting because I also think about the case of North Macedonia and how their accession process was basically interrupted by vetoing powers. But let's take that to the Q&A session, which I will now go to. We have some questions. The first one was the question of identity in Montenegro and the self-identification. I think we have answered that quite to an extent. Second one, which I would take is, what would you say? How does Serbia see Montenegro's current fast progress on the EU enlargement track?
Well, I can start and then people can jump in. So a couple of weeks ago, we did this strategic foresight exercise with some experts on the region, and we in a way created a scenario that assumed that Montenegro as well as Albania, together with Iceland, are joining the EU. And we wanted to understand the reactions from other countries in the region. And I think that what we have in a way realized through this exercise is that the reactions are quite negative, and that for these countries, let's say, the potential accession of Montenegro, above all for Serbia, is seen as a kind of a negative event. And what we could also see in the last couple of months were calls also by Serbian leadership for going for the regatta principle, meaning admitting all of the Western Balkan countries together, which obviously for Montenegro is not something that would work at the moment. So yes, reactions are not the most positive, I would say.
Yeah, I haven't done any research as Jelena did on this particular perception of Montenegro's EU accession, but it resonates what Jelena, you just summarized very well with what I observed in the media. So one would assume that, when one country has a positive prospect of joining the EU very soon, that this would reflect positively on other countries in the region as well. But we can see in Serbia and how it is kind of, in the government, well, the media, which is closer to government, that actually it's portrayed quite negatively. And this can additionally also be because of two reasons: that, of course, Serbia being the larger, the more dominant country in the region would be kind of on second, third, or even fourth place of joining. So it doesn't reflect necessarily well on them. And at the same time, with the current government and the Serbian Progressive Party kind of losing its positive image in the EU and kind of being embroiled in its own political crisis, it doesn't necessarily kind of Montenegro doesn't resemble a good partnership at the moment, right? Because they would look even worse, so to say. So of course, Montenegro not being able to progress and kind of playing the same multi-alignment blame game as Vučić does at the moment would kind of make them a very convenient partner for the current government. But even kind of by forces which used to be very anti-Western, aligning very closely with the narrative and kind of moderating the stances, which this brings Vučić in a more precarious position.
If I may add 2 points to what Jelena and Claudia said. I also didn't conduct any research, but what I can say from my point of view is these two points. The first brings me back to 2006 and the referendum, something that we had started with this morning or this afternoon in your case. It demonstrates this what's going on with Montenegro, and the fact that Montenegro is maybe a few steps from EU membership demonstrates better than anything else, better than any argument, that Montenegro has made a good, smart choice by deciding to be independent in 2006. We could only imagine, or we can imagine what could have happened with Montenegro had Montenegro made a different decision, and not just being a part of Serbia, but in what context and in how it would be treated within that Serbia with Vučić as a prime minister. So the second thing, also it's a reminder to Serbia that about missed opportunities. Many opportunities have been missed by Serbia in the last 15 years at least. Instead of being a leader of the region, a leader of reforms, leader of this Euro-Atlantic or European process, Serbia has become a spoiler and a country that actually drags back other countries and wants to slow down the process. So those two things definitely shape the way how they see the process, and this is why, in my view, they cannot easily accept or swallow the fact that Montenegro is close to become a European Union member.
Thank you. So you mean to say the closer they're reaching the goal, the more antagonistic rhetoric we will see from Serbia? Yeah, that was my question, but I will continue with.
Yes, you're a diplomat.
Serbia has tried with several so-called initiatives to, in fact, wrap up the region in its own problems. The one was the Balkans initiative, or I don't know that, which was also by I don't know, in my view, I can understand, supported at one point by former US administration, at least some people who were influential in the State Department at the time in the former US administration. As of recently, as you remember, Albanian Prime Minister and Serbian Prime Minister wrote a letter to Brussels, in fact, asking Brussels to get on board all the countries from the Balkans, but in not giving them full membership. So this is yet another attempt how they want to circumvent the potential membership of Montenegro to the EU. So this doesn't create, in my view, good atmosphere in the region. And is not for a long run and for a short run is not good for regional cooperation. I don't know. Jelena mentioned let's see what's going to happen in Serbia in next 6 to 9 months. We may have a new Serbia, hopefully, and then it will definitely reshape the dynamics in the region. But with this current government, I don't think that things will change for better in the future.
Yeah. There is a set of 2 questions because they are from the same person. I will ask them all together. The first one being, why does the EU often accept window dressing regarding reforms of EU accession, particularly concerning Chapter 27? And 23 and 25, there is large impunity, particularly with regards to environmental crime. And the last one was, what about rule of law? Despite evidence, Djukanovic and his family and friends still seem to be untouchable. And there has been an indictment of Djukanovic's brother. And since there was a BBC interview with Djukanovic, he says I didn't have the perception that he's showing some kind of accountability, but he's saying that, he said in the interview that they cannot provide the courts with evidence. That's why they keep painting a big picture of him in that sense. So, yeah. Claudia, would you like to go first?
Yes, I can start with a few thoughts. So I have to say that I don't have a satisfying answer why all these issues have not been addressed or why the EU is very happy to turn a blind eye at some of these developments. I would think, probably the best answer was provided by something that Vesko said earlier, and also Jelena by mentioning the momentum, that enlargement is often a very political decision. And regarding the environmental issues, which are also very pressing at the moment, we saw this also in the post-independence phase, right? When a large segment of the state enterprises were marked for tenders, along with privatization of coastal land, which with devastating consequences for the Montenegro environment and its people. And we see the same developments right now, right? Because we see on the one hand side, on paper, the push and the progress for European integration. And at the same time, which I assume the person who asked the question is probably referring to, is a recent plan by the government it's based on an adjusted spatial planning for development and real estate development in Montenegro, which marked more tenders and more land in the municipality of Ulcinj for real estate and infrastructure development, based on which the government made an agreement with the UAE to basically build huge hotel complexes in one of Montenegro's most environmentally valuable land, with terrible consequences for the entire environment and its people as well. And this progress, or this agreement, has been pushed through parliament with a simple majority, with some experts claimed that it actually touches upon constitutional provisions and it should be resolved by or addressed with a qualified majority, which then met deadlock in the Constitutional Court, which then the government claimed because of the deadlock it was constitutional. So we see there's a lot of circumvention of constitutional rules, of EU norms, but we also see quite acceptance of these breaches.
One of you, Jelena, please.
I very much agree with, I think we agree too much in this panel overall, with the fact that, again, EU accession is a process of adaptation, and it's as much legal, societal, transformative as it is a political process, right? So we could see a lot of ticking of the boxes on various levels, but what happens on the ground is sometimes lagging behind. And this is why in one of my previous comments, I also mentioned the importance of the accession treaty and how it will handle and what kind of safeguards it will put forward for Montenegro not to slide back, and which requirements will there be on Montenegro right ahead of EU accession. So this is perhaps an important issue to have in mind, because accountability for certain, let's say, good governance issues that have happened in the past will need to be taken in the context of, I guess, the last stages of accession.
Allow me actually to turn the things around for the sake of our discussion, and not just to say I agree, and we are all like-minded, I can say. But I wanted here to make a couple of points while not challenging the very question or the arguments about the need for Montenegro to address those issues properly. In fact, with this change of government, we have definitely we have change in who runs the country, but policies have not changed so much. When it's speaking about foreign policy, then we are thankful for that. But speaking about internal politics or the way how things are done internally, then we have a number of things to raise and to be concerned about, and you mentioned some of them. But I want just to put this in the context of European Union. The European Union has changed as well. This is not European Union of 20 years ago. Every enlargement changes European Union from within. And be honest, the core members are having a problem with democratic backsliding and the rise of alt-right. What we can do now, whether we can expel those members from the European Union, whether we can expel now 5 to 7 members. What if tomorrow, National Rally wins elections in France? Are we going to expel France from the European Union? Or we will deal and accept things as they are and deal with them in order to make things functional regardless of internal dynamics. So therefore, I see those things also from that perspective. European Union in this moment is willing to accept countries like Montenegro, regardless of their problems, internal problems. But the European Union itself is not perfect. And then things are changing, and this is the only way to go, in my view.
Thank you very much to all your thoughts, and keeping the time in mind, I would like you to make your closing statements, maybe about 2-3 minutes, with maybe kind of foresight for the European Union and Montenegro's role in the European Union. I will go backwards and start with Jelena this time.
Right. So, look, as someone who's a Montenegrin national who's been working on the country's EU accession for a long time and who's been living in the EU for a long time, I honestly, there are very few people who could be happier to see Montenegro become an EU member state. Now, obviously, there are still issues to be resolved. And what I hope is that these issues will be resolved, and that eventually Montenegro, not eventually, let's say by the end of the decade, as they like to say in the EU circles, Montenegro will become a member state of the European Union. What it can offer to the EU is a kind of a bridge with the Western Balkan region. It can infuse energy into a process that has been very, very slow over the last more than 10, 12 years. And what I believe is that Montenegro will change by default by becoming an EU member state in the ways in which Croatia has changed, in the ways in which Slovenia has changed, not only due to the economic assistance it would receive as a member state of the European Union, but also socially and culturally. So there I see an incredible opportunity, both for Montenegro, but also for the European Union to, in a way, showcase that enlargement still works and that we can work with the template that Montenegro can help to design for the rest of the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. Would you like to continue, Vesko?
Yes, I would like to continue on the same positive note. I would like to say that regardless of challenges that we have addressed in our interventions since the independence, regaining independence 20 years ago, Montenegro managed to showcase that, it can be a relatively successful story from this part of the world, from the part of Europe. I know that independence was seen and perceived by European partners with suspicion, and they believed more in some other countries in the region, but it has turned out now in retrospect that Montenegro has managed to navigate through those challenges relatively successfully. So on a different note, I will tell, I can't help but saying that Montenegro will be facing similar or same challenges in the future. It will be internally divided with external actors like Serbian Orthodox Church being very active. And the problems that we have addressed, like the rule of law, relatively weak judiciary and politicized judiciary, and so on, so will remain. But membership to the European Union, I agree with Jelena, will help and may actually infuse a new optimism, a new energy into the country to address some those issues. Particularly rule of law and judiciary more rigorously than before.
Thank you. And last but not the least, Claudia, please let us have your thoughts.
Thank you. There's only little left to say after Jelena's and Vesko's statements. But yeah, to pick up on something which both of you said earlier, I think in terms of identity, the European Union can be a chance, because we can see kind of, identities are very hybrid and fluid, and kind of, maybe it can be a chance also to adding a more, another layer and opportunity to this very hard cleavage, which still persists in Montenegrin society, although we currently have a mixed government. The national cleavage has not subsided. It has more been compartmentalized, where each kind of party stresses kind of, issues which are important to their particular constituency. But still, I think, there are a lot of elements in society which feel they have been excluded from state building, as it was in the decades before, which seek acknowledgement and which can be mobilized as a mass also by some subversive actors. And I think the European Union can also be a chance for Montenegro maybe to learn also from the position of other small states, because being a small state has a lot of kind of, chances. For example, oftentimes we see that small states leverage their position in international organizations for issues such as human rights, ecological issues, kind of be a broker in diplomacy. And also oftentimes you see small states which have limited economic resources to develop expertise, for example, in cyber or digital innovations, which could also be kind of a great opportunity for Montenegro instead of exploiting its very finite and valuable limited economic resources, which just, where money changes from one hand to the other.
you, Claudia, and thank you for your very positive ending notes, because I see it similar way. Small states have a very important, or can play an important role, not only in the European Union, but also on a global perspective. Thank you very much for agreeing to this panel discussion regarding the 20-year referendum of Montenegro, and I hope that next time we have this panel, Montenegro will be part of the European Union, and we will discuss about what the chances are and how they can shape and form the European Union itself. And also with 2 or 3 or the whole Western Balkans in the European Union, but we will see. I would also like to thank the Southeast Europe Association for this opportunity and all those who have joined us for this discussion. Please keep in touch either via email or LinkedIn. Stay in touch, keep talking about, keep the discussion alive, and thank you very much for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.